Great. So good evening, everyone. I have the pleasure to be welcoming you to tonight's sustainability seminar, which is the first one that is hosted at Kellogg. And we will be focusing on net zero policies and politics with a very special focus on environmental and climate justice. And I'm Johanna Arlinghaus. I'll be hosting or chairing tonight's event. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment here at Oxford University. And I'm also a research member of the Common Room of this college. So this is how I came to organize this event tonight. And so I currently work on greenhouse gas removal. So my own research is not directly but indirectly linked to today's topic. Nevertheless, I'm very interested in this justice aspect because net zero and justice are indeed intricately linked to each other. So for example, data from the World Inequality Database actually shows that 10% of the world's population are responsible for almost half of greenhouse gas emissions, while the bottom half of the world contributes just 12% of emissions. And that's not just a rich versus poor countries divide. So of course, you also have large emitters in poor countries and low emitters in rich countries. But nevertheless, per capita emissions are intricately linked to income. And what's more, the impacts of climate change are disproportionately felt by low-income groups and are also more heavily felt by countries in the global south. And so today we have several very fascinating speakers who will be discussing first net zero as a concept, but then also equity from a range of perspectives. So we have a global perspective as well as a local one. We have a global north as well as a global south perspective. And so the first speaker is Sam Fankhauser, who is a professor of climate economics and policy at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. And he will be setting the scene and introduce the concept of net zero emissions to us. And then we have Alexis McGiven, who is the net zero standards manager at Oxford Net Zero, and who will discuss net zero as well as recent development in the light of climate justice, including at COP. Samir Baitzin is a geospatial researcher at the Environmental Change Institute, and she will discuss some of her work on the geospatial inequality in exposure to environmental damages. And last but not least, we have Anna Railton, who is the Oxford City Council cabinet member for Zero Carbon Oxford and Climate Justice. And she'll cover the more local aspects that I think we can all identify with living in the city. So we'll have 4 inputs by the speakers of roughly 7 minutes each. And that will be followed by a discussion as well as a Q&A with all of you. So we'll be looking forward to having your questions. And yeah, so this is the first sustainability seminar at Kellogg. There will also be a Green Week taking place. I think this college has or is developing a very strong focus on sustainability, actually. So that Green Week will come up at the first week of the Trinity term, and I think there'll be announcements on the websites of what exactly that will entail. But just to flag that to you. So I think we can jump right in with Sam. And yes, looking forward.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and thanks for spending Valentine's Day with us. And thanks, Johanna, for the introduction, Jonathan, for setting up the event and inviting us. I will start right at the beginning with a bit of a refresher for many of you. What do we mean by net zero? Where does that concept of net zero come from? And then sort of right at the end, when my 7 minutes are up, sort of start explaining, how it applies to the fellow panelists, if that makes sense, and how does one implement net zero in the real world. Net zero is a scientific concept. It's sort of a recognition of how atmospheric physics works, but for a lot of people, it's in a sense it's a shortcut that says if I want to be net zero, that sort of means like I want to be compliant with the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement, of course, is the big international treaty that we have on climate change, where pretty much every country on the planet came together. It was in 2015, so quite some time back, and agreed as a global community that net zero emissions was the goal that we should adhere to as a community, as a global community, as a species, to fight climate change. Specifically, what the Paris Agreement said is that dangerous climate change starts somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius warming compared to pre-industrial times. That's sort of an assessment of when climate change becomes more dangerous, basically, when bad things start to happen to coral reefs, to glaciers, to unique systems, and when the distributional impacts and the aggregate impacts become too bad. Now, the atmosphere is quite a complex thing, but there's a couple of complicated trends that net each other out that you can ignore, or an economist like me would ignore. And that then simplifies the task of keeping global temperatures below 2 degrees to something very simple. That simple correlation is that the amount of warming you observe is a function of the cumulative amount of CO2 that you put into the atmosphere. So everything else that's going on nets itself out, and it's really that simple. If you stop putting carbon into the atmosphere, global warming stops. And you can think of it like a bathtub. Water comes in, and eventually you sort of reach the level you want to have, and at that point you have to stop. 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade is associated with a particular amount of carbon that you can put into the atmosphere, and that amount of carbon that is left to put into the atmosphere is about 250 billion tons of CO2. So 250 gigatons of carbon is the space we have left in the atmosphere. That means we have most of the space we have actually used up. 250 gigatons, if you wonder how much that is. We currently emit about 40 gigatons or so a year. So we use up what we have left in about 10 years or less, unless we start bringing those emissions down. And that's sort of what this chart sort of tries to illustrate. How quickly do we use up that 250 gigatons? That's a societal choice. The scientists have told us what the carbon constraint is. Society now has to decide, how do we use it up? And that means how fast do we use it up? But it also means who gets access to that space. How do we allocate that carbon space? This chart there shows you what happens in terms of speed. That's sort of emissions in the historic trends, emissions in the past. And if we keep going like that, we use up our 250 billion tons pretty quickly, and it means we have to come down really, really very steep and very fast. Or we do it a bit more gently. We start to reduce emission. Gently is a relative term in this context. We start to reduce emissions now as fast as we can, and that gives us a little bit more space that we have to use up the 250 gigatons. If you then run models and sort of ask models of energy systems of the economy, you ask about behavioral realities, population growth, innovation, technology, and all that, and you figure out, how should I use up that carbon space? The models will tell you sort of a path that looks a little bit like that. That's a sort of a range of possible paths. And the rational way, or the modeled rational way of using up my carbon space, the 250 billion tons, looks like this. It sort of means we reduce our global emissions. Globally, emissions we reduce by about half, somewhere around 2030, early 2030s. And we reach the point where we've used up our carbon budget by about the middle of the century. So by the middle of the century, we've used up the 250 gigatons. What happens when we've used up the 250 gigatons? That's where the concept of net zero comes in. When we've used up the space in the atmosphere, we have to have a balance between carbon that we continue to put up there and carbon that we remove from the atmosphere. That's that sort of net zero balance refers to the balance between what we put up there and what we take out. Again, you can think of the bathtub. If it's full, the amount of water that flows into it has to be balanced by the amount of water that flows out of it. So that gives us net zero. That chart here sort of exemplifies how that balance will look. You need to have a balance between the Earth's crust, where the oil and the coal and the gas is located, the atmosphere, where the carbon goes when we burn that oil, gas and coal, and the biosphere, which absorbs carbon, for example, through tree growth and in oceans and in soils. So that's net zero 101, as it were, just to bring everybody up to speed. What does it all mean then if we move on to implementing that concept as a political concept or as a policy concept? What does it mean in terms of what we have to do? And we've summarized that in a paper a couple of years back, which has 7 buckets in it, 7 things one has to do, but I only give you the highlights, the 3 generic buckets. The first thing we have to do is we have to reduce emissions as fast as we can. And that's sort of the story about, you know, not using up the carbon space too soon and having to come down very steeply. That's the story of doing it as gently as we can to go with technological progress and with economic progress. But you have to do it as fast as you can. And there's, you know, if you want to be at 50% down within 10 years, that is very fast indeed. So that's the first thing you have to do, and you have to reduce those emissions everywhere. There is no hiding space, as it were. You can't just say, my emissions are somehow exempt. Every emission source has to be treated. The second sort of implications of net zero has to do with the net bit, the removal of carbon from the atmosphere. And that is something we have to do because there will be some residual emissions left, but we have to do that in an environmentally, socially considerate way. We have to do that with lots of integrity. We don't want greenwashing. We want to make sure that those net zero pledges that we hear are genuine pledges, that the removal that happens has environmental standards, is sort of permanently removed carbon, and there's a sort of a lot packed into this integrity box. We can remove carbon from the atmosphere, but we can do that badly as well as right. Finally, we want to embed net zero into broader notions of sustainability. Climate change is one of the biggest threats we face. I deeply believe that, but it's not the only threat we face. We have other environmental threats, other social threats, and we have to put climate change into that broader context of sustainable development. That means a couple of things. It means worrying about ecological side effects, you know, the interaction between biodiversity loss and climate change. It means worrying about the equitable aspects of the transition. It means worrying about what happens to high carbon workers. It means worrying what happens to low income countries and their growth prospects. All that has to be factored in. But the good news is, the final thing there are also economic opportunities coming out of the net zero transition. There's a big sort of prize to be won if you're a business leader in the clean energy world, for example, if you're a business leader in clean cars, in renewables, in batteries, in energy efficiency. So there's an economic side to all of this as well. I'm pretty sure my 7 minutes have been up for a while, so let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that brilliant introduction to net zero. My name is Alexis McGivern. I work for the Oxford Net Zero Initiative. So thanks so much, Johanna, for inviting me. Thank you so much, Kellogg College, for having us for this discussion tonight. Really delighted to be talking to you about how net zero fits in with climate justice. And I just want to begin by acknowledging it can be a bit strange and sort of overwhelming to be in these comfortable, safe spaces in Oxford while the state of global news is very overwhelming and heartbreaking. So just want to acknowledge that many people have some big emotions around what's happening in Gaza right now. And it's important to conceptualize climate justice within other forms of justice too. So I'm here to talk to you about net zero policies and politics and whether or not net zero can be an instrument of climate justice. So here are two photos from a few months ago from my camera roll. On the left, a demonstration from the 350.org coalition. This was at COP28. I don't know if you can see the banner. It says, "We are not drowning, we are fighting." This was a really powerful demonstration done in the sort of latter part of the negotiations by a group of Pacific Islanders who have been really leading the charge on ambitious agreements at the UNFCCC level. The UNFCCC being the framework convention that is sort of the umbrella for all of our climate policy, international climate policy. On the right is a picture from one of the only demonstrations that happened during COP28 in Dubai, because political demonstrations were strictly disallowed other than a special permit was given for one demonstration in the blue zone, which is where the negotiations happen. And this was a massive coalition of climate justice and civil society organizations who came together under the banner of actually a ceasefire march, but lots of different civil society organizations coming together to talk about just and equitable transition. The sort of tagline for the climate justice movement at COP28 was about fossil fuel phase out, and that being fast, fair, forever, all these kind of F words for fossil fuel phase out. And that was kind of a big part of our discussion. So I'll situate that a little bit within our discussions about net zero. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the Net Zero Tracker, we track at Oxford Net Zero, along with some other institutions in the University of North Carolina, New Climate Institute, and the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit in London, track the net zero commitments of the Forbes 2000, so the 2,000 largest publicly listed companies in the world, every city above 100,000 people in population, and every country in the world. And this really emerged as a answer to the fact that we not only assess whether they have a net zero target, but also the quality of that target. And this emerged because at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, there were many, many discussions about net zero and net zero as both a physical science principle, but also as a frame for climate action, as Sam has situated us, net zero obviously being the piece that we are working towards in the Paris Agreement. So there were a lot of discussions and a lot of announcements made for net zero pledges, and companies, countries making very public net zero pledges. And then once the dust settled after COP26, people asked themselves, well, what does it actually mean to make a net zero pledge? And what does good net zero look like? And there actually wasn't a robust enough governance landscape to really hold actors to account once they had made a net zero pledge. So our net zero tracker kind of works as one of those watchdog elements to say, we know how many people have made a net zero target, and we evaluate the quality of that target. And each year we publish a stock take report to say there is a massive amount of coverage of net zero targets, but only X% of them are actually of quality. A surplus of confusion and a deficit of credibility. Can anyone guess who said that? I'll take popcorn style. You can shout it out if you know. Okay. Well, Sam knows, but so this is from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and he was talking about the landscape of net zero, which I definitely agree with him. If you have well, I don't know if anyone else does, but if you have a Google alert for stories related to net zero, you'll see that there is a headline pretty much every day or a few times a day about net zero. From all different angles, both people talking about net zero being a tool for greenwashing, or this was the headline on carbon offsets was from last January, and a lot of criticism about net zero. And as I mentioned, there needs to be a robust governance landscape, and that's a lot of what we do at Oxford Net Zero, is trying to inform policymakers, standard setters, civil society, and businesses on what high integrity net zero actually looks like and how they can get there. But the important piece of that, and what must not be forgotten, of course, is where the climate justice movement fits into a definition of high integrity net zero. So this was a massive open letter that was signed by a number of different climate justice groups ahead of COP26. Basically, there were multiple hundreds of signatories from all around the world saying that they wanted world leaders to take quote unquote real action and not quote unquote net zero. So the frustration with net zero as a frame, which I'll come to a little bit later, is really that net zero can be used to justify this approach of emit now and make provisions for offsetting or removals later. And this is a frustration from the climate justice movement, not only because there's a trust in institutions to actually do that removal, but also that the burning of fossil fuels, which is the cause of 75 to 80% of our emissions, is bad for reasons other than just putting too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Even if we manage to 100% abate, so remove all of the emissions that are related to, for example, energy-related emissions, we would still have the issues of biodiversity loss, of human health issues, of land tenure issues, of, there's many, many different reasons why using fossil fuels is not the best way to serve a democratic energy system. So in response to that, myself and a few colleagues, including Jessica Omokuti, who has done some really fantastic work on what it means to have inclusive net zero. And actually just today I was watching a lecture that she gave a few years ago for Tufts University in 2021 on basically inclusive net zero. And it's up on YouTube. I highly recommend that you watch it. She's an excellent communicator and excellent academic. But we looked at whether or not we can still consider net zero to be an instrument of climate justice. So this is our paper. It's open access. You can read it online, but in case you're not interested in reading it, but you should be, here's sort of a brief overview of what we said. And that the current trends in how net zero is being applied and used accentuate climate injustices, as we called them. So the first is what I had just mentioned, that the focus on matching, greenhouse gas emissions sources and sinks removes climate change from the broader socio-ecological conditions. So as I just mentioned, there are reasons why we should be dealing with climate change for reasons more than just too much carbon in the atmosphere. The second is this idea of a shift to mid-century timelines. So as we've seen before, many countries who have committed to nationally determined contributions, so that's their piece of the puzzle for the Paris Agreement, have sometimes fallen into the trap of allowing for business as usual until about 2045 and then accounting for a huge amount of removals capacity in order to meet their target for net zero by 2050. So that's the fear, is that there's a shift to mid-century timelines which removes the urgent need to act right now. The third is an over-reliance or just a growing reliance on future availability of carbon dioxide removal technology and infrastructures, both on the technological capacity, but also on the question of who will pay for it, who will maintain it, who gets to use the remaining atmospheric space. Is it something that the United States should be able to use, or should it be Zambia or Azerbaijan or any other country that has still growing development needs? And the final is just a marginalization of adaptation needs, and that net zero, the framing of net zero really doesn't have much space for discussions about adaptation. So yeah, there's very little in the governance landscape. I'll just finish on this, and these are kind of the general climate justice concerns. My research focuses primarily on how climate justice groups view not only the frame of net zero, but also how the emerging governance landscape, which has changed considerably since COP26 2021, big Wild West on everyone was making net zero pledges and there was no infrastructure to assess their quality, that has changed very significantly, and there is a good governance system. But the question is, does that governance system work to address the concerns of the climate justice movement? So obviously carbon offsets and land use and land being used for carbon offsets rather than for legitimate land and agricultural uses brings to mind this term of carbon colonialism, so sequestering land to be used to offset the footprints of people in the global north. A depoliticization of net zero, so a narrowing of net zero to emissions in, emissions out, rather than the complex landscape of climate change. Fears over reliance, a real historical distrust of corporate actors to implement high integrity solutions. This big political debate over whether or not net zero should necessarily encompass a phase out of fossil fuels, and restoration of biodiversity, and especially concerns about distribution of climate solutions. And I'm just giving a quick nod to Sam's research on the patents that are held for climate tech and how those are concentrated in just 5 countries in the world. So that was a very whistle-stop tour of net zero and climate justice, but looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Samira Barzan. I'm a geospatial economic analyst. That's my official title. I'm also a senior researcher in the Environmental Change Institute. So a sister organization to Sam at the Smith School, but we all work for the same thing, overarching, so we like each other. So my work is follows up from what Alexis and Sam was talking, but also I go much more into what does it actually mean, and you will see what I mean in a second. And foremost want to thank Johanna, because normally I get invited to talk about what I do, but not really why I do it. Today I get to talk about why I do it, and this is for me deeply personal, and you will see why. So what I work on is basically cross-evaluating a lot of the things that Sam is saying, that Alexis is saying, that other people are saying, and try and understand what does it actually mean, does it hold up, and what does it mean for different places on the world. Now, I wanted to be a politician when I was younger, and the reason I wanted to be a politician is because I didn't like the world that I lived in, and I knew politics was the way to maybe change it a little bit. So actually I came from a purely economic development angle. And for me, poverty was not the absence of money, but it was an economic injustice. And then in my master at the LSE, I fell very much in love with all the works by Amartya Sen, because he does not just look at poverty as absence of money, but as an injustice. And oftentimes, if you're born into poverty, this is where you stay. And no one deserves more than anyone else to be born into poverty. So this was my main driver when I was in my master. And then at some point, I realized that poverty in the 21st century cannot be separated from climate. If you're poor globally, you're much more likely to be unequipped to deal with climate. You're also much less likely to have contributed to climate because your lifestyle has a much lower carbon footprint. So there's a double inequality. Both you're not well equipped to handle it, whatever the consequences may be, and you also have contributed a lot less. So what I show you here, this is my own map, but it's not I didn't generate the data, I just put it on a nice map. This is the Climate Vulnerability Index produced by the Notre Dame University in the US, and it is an index, therefore it's normalized between 0 and 1. And it shows you countries that are particularly exposed to climate, and they're in conjunction with their inability to deal with it. So the vulnerability comes both from how much you're exposed to climate change, but also how well equipped you are. And you see there's a large concentration on a very specific set of countries. Now, what you also see, I took this at some random conference, but this, and I explicitly showing you this, even though the quality is just my iPhone, because this could have happened at any conference. This was someone talking about a health study and excluded most of the world's countries because there's no data. So you see, we have an absence of knowledge for exactly those countries that are particularly red. This is why I got into all the tech stuff, because I was like, this is not right. And you know, where the knowledge is concentrated is also highly political. So if we do studies on the global north, they're nowhere representative for places in the global south. So we also have to be very aware that the issues that we see here are not reflective of what other people are doing. And we fall very short if we only constrain ourselves to the places in which there is data. So I start to look for satellites because they fly everywhere. And this is basically what I do now. I try to fill exactly those gray zones with numbers because I know those are the places that need it the most urgently. So there's a justice in knowledge, but there's also a justice in climate. Now, this is a much cleaner version of this because this is for you to see. The other one was just a photo, but it's the same story. This is just an index of statistical capacity. So this is what I normally do. I run algorithms on satellites to detect things, as most of people do that work on satellites. This is an algorithm that detects building infrastructure. This is, for example, highly important also for humanitarian purposes, so not just for insurance. They like these things, but also if you think of the earthquake in Syria and Turkey, you could do a pixel classification before and after the disaster and see where the buildings were most destroyed by looking at the difference in pixels before and after, and then help emergency aid be rerouted to those places that needed it the most. I can also tell you there was an inequality there because if you're richer, you have a much larger house, a much lower level of person to footprint, so were much less likely to be affected by the earthquake as if you were poor. On the Syrian side, it was because Assad had been bombing North Syria, so the houses were already very unstable. On the Turkish side, there were a lot of houses quickly erected to house the refugees. So that was also, the earthquake was not unequal, but our societies are built so unequally that whatever happens on the climate side, earthquakes are not climate, but they're also a disaster, reinforces the inequality that we have ingrained into our systems. Then something else I do. This is greenhouse gas remote sensing. So you can now trace methane leaks to the source. So you go from an image like you have on the left to a source that you see in the middle. And then I zoomed in to show you what it is. This is a waste site outside Amman in Jordan. So we can not just talk about carbon in some abstract way. We can now actually go to the source and oftentimes also fix leaks. That can also do a lot. Or this is something else. This is a land use model that can show you in near real time with 1 day delay how environments change. I will talk about this in a second again, but this is a city in southern Congo that has expanded massively with mining activity. And everything that is gray, that's the mine, and everything that's red is built up land cover. But you can now, without ever having gone to Congo, you can do this in 5 minutes. Well, if you have some technical skills, but there is no other reason why you cannot do that. So we can even trace changes on the planet in near real time without even going there. Now, this is what I normally do. I go from a place like this. This is some work I did for the World Bank. There's a paper on this, but I spared you the technical details here because that's really not the point. But if you want to read it, it is out there. This is some work I did because the World Bank really needed to know how cities are internally organized and where the employment course of the cities. Oftentimes we don't have any data on developing countries, definitely not within cities, oftentimes not even across cities. So I built them an algorithm on various satellite and big data sources to help them predict cities. So now they can go based on what I gave them from an image like this on the left, which is Karachi, to a prediction on employment on the right. And that helps also with where should you put flood protection, because you should put it where people work in the day, because that's where they are. Low carbon transport planning, so public transport planning and all sorts of other things. So this really goes into filling data gaps so we can make better policy for the places where we just fall very short with traditional data. Now, one of the examples of my work that directly links to environmental justice, and I keep this a little bit on the mitigation side to fit the theme. I also do some work on the adaptation. So that goes to exposure to flooding, etc., but I keep it on the other side. This is a distribution of air quality measurement stations around the globe. And I can tell you the whole continent of Africa has less than the city of Paris, and almost all of them are outside American embassies. So we know very, very little about what's going on, but satellites go everywhere, so we can trace it. So this on the right, on the left, you see an image of a satellite measure of air quality. And on the right, you see me overlaying it with information on household wealth by village to basically pinpoint the villages that are particularly poor and particularly exposed to air quality, to really show if we need to go somewhere, this is where we should go first, because these people will have health consequences. Another example is this. This is some ongoing work. Now on the left, you see a Tesla. Very nice. We want that. But on the right, you also see what that means. So, these things are interlinked, because what is in the Tesla battery? It's lithium, whereas lithium mined also in Congo, where it looks like this. So we also have to be aware of when we transition, there's not just a justice element that we transition, but it also matters how we transition and who is transitioning. These global South countries haven't contributed anyway. They literally told me, for us, they're not critical minerals because they're not critical for us, and they're very right. But then what do we do if we know almost half of the world's mines is undocumented, where these minerals come from, and renewable energies are very much more mineral intensive? And I can tell you that almost all studies are based on S&P, and S&P only captures a very small fraction of mines. So you also know there's a lot of human rights issues around mines, with building destruction, but also other things. And this is some work I do to put some transparency on it. You can see me tracing a specific mine in southern Congo. This is the biggest cobalt mine on the planet. It's owned by a Swiss company. It's owned by Glencore. And you might also see there's a golf course. Now, I can tell you this golf course is not for these people. Where are they? Here. Right? So that's also there. Then the third, and this is my last pitch of what I'm doing. This is environmental justice kind of meets resource course. The one of you that know me knows part of me is always in the Middle East, so I feel very strongly about that region. That region doesn't just have an oil issue, it also has an authoritarian issue. So almost all data that comes from authoritarian states is not to be trusted because it's generally manipulated. But you also know that where there's oil flares, there's a lot of environmental burden. So there's lots of cases of leukemia and other forms of cancer recorded in children in Iraq, for example. But from a satellite, we can see gas flares. So these are gas flares linked to oil extraction sites. And I also know that Iran is where my heart has a lot of protests, always has. And if you look at that province there called Khuzestan with the K, you see it has a very, very high pattern of protest, and that is the region where Iran pumps most of the oil. It's also a region where ethnic minority lives, so there's a third layer of inequality there. So what I did with some sociologists, this is how people die in protest. Generally, they're being shot by government forces. So with some sociologists, I work on a project to see if people that are closer to oil sites and exposed to the fumes that come from oils are more likely to protest. And the answer is yes. That paper is in review in a sociology journal, but happy to talk about this. Now, the last layer of inequality is, let me show you how many satellites we have and who owns them. It's 2 people. But these are also, so it's Bezos and predominantly it's Starlink by Elon Musk. So I just want to say knowledge in itself is also highly unequally distributed, linking up to what Alexa said with the patterns. The last thing I want to say, you can also see dead people. So we can see there's no reason why we can't counter check a lot of things because we have resolutions up to 15 centimeters. People are you can see your shoe from space if you were to want to. And you can definitely see things that maybe you don't even want to see. There's no reason to not validate and cross-check. And this is why I do it. This is my dad and me. I'm that little person there. So my dad made me go to protest when I was very little. So this is just me continuing what my father started, but doing it with numbers, even though I spared you all the algorithms today. But this is why this is very personal. And I want to thank Johanna for allowing me to talk about this part and not just about which algorithm is the better one for which purpose and what's the bias. So thanks, Johanna, for allowing me to also talk about that side. And happy to talk about anything if you have any interest.
Thank you very much. Let's just, there we go. Yes, I forgot to put a title slide on. Sorry, I guess I'm the one non-academic here, which maybe that's why. So yes, this evening I'm very briefly going to give you both a local government and an Oxford perspective on climate justice. So I'm going to show you a couple of images and what they mean for the future of Oxford and how local authorities fit into the picture. So this is Abingdon Road, a couple of miles from here during the flooding last month. As our winters get milder and wetter, this is increasingly going to be our future, and we need to make our peace with that. So this is also the ward in the city I represent, and for all intents and purposes, the flooding response in January was pretty slick, and we also got pretty lucky. If we'd have had an extra day of rain, we would have had hundreds of people's homes flooded. However, in my ward, we did have two homes flooded. They turned out to be a pair of not brilliantly well-constructed sort of 1960s houses, which were a good foot lower than all of their much better built 1930s neighbours. As you can imagine, private homeowners wouldn't touch that kind of thing with a barge pole. So naturally, these were both privately let HMOs. One of them had an extended family in them. The other had a set of sort of young professionals. And I guess, what happens when this sort of thing becomes more frequent and, homes like this become uninsurable? Those with the means will either leave or be able to self-insure, and the ones who are left are the ones who are least able to recover. So the second one, these are the top 10 hottest days on record in the UK. So where's the laser thing? So this one up here is July 2022. And I very much remember sort of a couple of days effectively cowering in my house with the curtains closed, and a very annoyed dog. And I'm sure many other people have sort of similar sort of memories of this when it was above 40 degrees in Oxford, I think for the first time ever for a number of days. And it was a real wake-up call for a number of people. When it comes to heat waves, basically most of our housing stock in the UK is not well suited to heat at all. I mean, it's barely well suited to cold. And overwhelmingly those in the housing stock least well suited to heat waves, basically poorly insulated flats, are those also least well placed to do anything about it. So, yeah, and people who are struggling to pay the bills, in precarious employment, lots of sort of like other issues going on, they are not installing aircon in a flat where they already pay too much money in rent, right? They cannot possibly make the adaptations required for when this, 40-degree heat in the UK becomes much more commonplace. And, we are very much not set up to deal with this across the country. There's a labour angle to this as well. How do we protect those who have to work outside in conditions like this? Like I work in an office, that office has aircon, I can go home and live in a house that I have the means to make adaptations to. This is very much not true for most people in the UK. I also really don't need to labour the point for this audience about what this distribution of dots means and tells us about our future. So, the connection between, these two images is threefold. So one, this is our future, certainly here in Oxford. Two, local authorities and the public sector are the ones who both have to coordinate the response to this and have to pick up the pieces from events like these. And three, which is very much the point that's already been made, is that those are already the most deprived and the most vulnerable are the ones who will be hit the hardest. So I also have a map. So if you take a map of deprivation and you overlay a map of health inequality and you overlay a map of tree cover, they turn out in Oxford to all be the same map. So this is, hopefully the Woodland Trust has made this. This is a tree equity score thing. And yeah, it already tells us what we already know. So Oxford is the second most unequal city in the UK. It's basically the only time where I'm happy for Cambridge to beat us at something. So, I mean, already right now, I'm not very good at this laser pointer. Where does it go? Okay, the yellow stuff at the bottom, there is a 10-year difference in life expectancy today between people in yellow at the bottom and people in green at the top. And, and when there are extended heat waves in Oxford, in the UK, the people in this yellow stuff around the edges, they're going to die much more than the people at the top of this graph. The other sort of angle here is that those who are currently struggling and will feel the worst effects of all of this, as we can see, also basically have the least bandwidth to be worried about it, right? If we want to sell the importance of climate mitigation, climate adaptation to folks like these, we have to talk about it not in terms of net zero, not in terms of carbon removal, not in terms of emissions, but in terms of cost of living and in terms of health. And, importantly, the policies we come up with also basically can't make it more difficult for them than it already is, and it also can't cost them more money, hopefully. But yes, this has all been a bit depressing. So, what do we do about all of this? So yes, I believe that, as, local authority, as Oxford City Council, having a buildings focus is key. We love to argue about transport in Oxford, but most of our emissions come from buildings, namely from heating those buildings. And it's where we need to rapidly adapt at scale. So, this is a combination of retrofitting council housing, retrofitting housing association homes, getting the right resources for owner-occupiers to do the same, and finding mechanisms for private landlords to retrofit their properties, because this is super difficult, but we really have to tackle it because fully 50% of people in Oxford live in the private rented sector. So yeah, this Clean Heat Streets up on the thing here, this is a scheme in Rose Hill where we are trying to fit 100 heat pumps over the sort of vaguely highlighted streets there. So, targeting all different sorts of tenancies, all people from different backgrounds, because we have to be clear that retrofit can't just be a white middle class pursuit. We have to do this everywhere, and the benefits need to be felt by everyone. It's also, this scheme is trying to be a bottom-up programme, building on the fantastic work of a grassroots group called Rose Hill and Iffley Low Carbon, who've been working on energy efficiency in buildings for a good decade. There's also been a real effort to get the local community involved, with residents opening up their own homes to be show homes, and employing Rose Hill residents to do the comms and the engagement and translation work and stuff like this. So yeah, this scheme is all about flushing out the problems with doing things like this at scale. So be it planning, grid stuff, which is an increasingly massive problem, and access to skilled tradespeople, that sort of stuff. But it's also not just about the mechanical, like spade in the ground stuff. It's also getting the engagement piece right as well. It's sort of, how do you sell this to people when they've got it installed? How do you make sure they use their heat pump properly? Like this kind of thing. These kind of soft interventions, how you get those right at scale as well. So yeah, and hopefully build a model for how to do this in the future, not just across Oxford, but across the UK. Because, if we want to be net zero city by 2040, that means that none of our buildings can be heated by gas anymore, and pretty much nearly every single one of the 60,000 homes in Oxford are currently heated by gas. So yeah, we really do need to get moving on that. Finally, I think I'm just going to sort of do a bit of a local government plug, because I always do that. The real value of local government here is that it's local. We know our communities, and we can be on the ground doing this with our residents instead of to them, right? We're the ones who need to be there, but we also need the power and resource to be able to do this effectively and at scale. Finally, I'm a politician. I got into politics to do something about climate change. The values I've got about equity, about equality of opportunity, about working together as communities to achieve more than we can achieve alone. This needs to play out in our response to climate change. It's not going to work only as a top-down thing from Whitehall, although there's a lot they can do. It's not going to work if only white middle-class folks install heat pumps, and it's not going to work if we just continue to leave people behind. Climate justice is basically identically social justice here. And finally, and local government very much is key to its delivery. So, yeah.
Thanks to all of our 4 panelists. I was actually fascinated by your input. So I think time management has suffered from that because I was listening so intently. I think we have permission from Kellogg's president to run over time. So we'll make use of that privilege. And we do have a microphone in the audience, I think. And I bet you all have. I prepared questions to ask the panelists, but I think you must all have some after these 4 interesting inputs. So I think I'll just hand it over right to you.
Thank you for the panelists for the brilliant presentation. It's very impressive and intriguing. And I do have a question here. I don't want to set a gloomy tone to start with the first question, to say that it looks like an extremely comprehensive and complicated project. We have a target date according to the Paris Agreement, and we have a limited amount of the numbers we need to achieve, as included in the first presentation. But unfortunately, based on human nature as well as all these experience we had in history, I've never seen any successful implementation of a comprehensive program can achieve their budget timeline and what they're supposed to achieve. Never happened, right? Particularly to this scale. And on top of that, as of today, I think if you look back into history, there's a lot of fight with resource, oil, gas until today. A lot of war was triggered because of that. And now we have a limited amount of carbon that we can send into the atmosphere. That's a kind of resource that people will fight for, right? Between different countries and political environment, so on and so forth. So how do we address that as we know that deemed to be failed almost program we want to achieve? Work together as a human being to achieve this impossible goal.
That's certainly not an easy question.
Is that thing on? Okay, this is better. A very good question as well. Let me sort of try to be a bit more optimistic than we have been as a collective tonight. Two observations. One is that we are sort of reaching certain societal tipping points. There are environmental tipping points, that's the bits that worry us. But there are also societal, engineering, technical tipping points which give cause for hope. If you sort of look at the emission sources and where they come from, there's about 40, maybe 50% of those are nearing a tipping point where self-interest, market forces, and just cost considerations will take care of the problem. Renewable energy is now probably cheaper than fossil fuels in most contexts. Electric vehicles are nearing that point where that is the case. And so we're starting to see a dynamic where climate change is no longer about allocating a burden, it's about chasing a price. And once you start chasing a price, the dynamics change. And that's sort of the second point is that this isn't just rhetoric. You can start seeing the economic opportunities being pursued and the economic opportunities being sort of sought. In the UK, we are very proud of our Climate Change Act, and it's called that. It's a Climate Change Act. If you look at South Korea, for example, their equivalent law is called the Low Carbon Green Growth Act. So they have a dual objective, which is bring down emissions, fine, absolutely have to do that, but then also become the economic champion of the green economy that's coming. And once we start moving into that mindset, which countries and people start doing, the incentives change. It's still a long slog.
Thanks so much. And to add to Sam's very excellent answer, I think we get this question a lot. So the scale of the problem is so huge, and how can we overcome all the many barriers to solving it? And I do think at a certain point we just have to keep going with the work that we're doing. That there's kind of like being in a basketball game and throwing a ball at the buzzer, like you don't know if it's going to go in, but there's no option not to. And I think whether I wake up every other day in either a very pessimistic mood or a very optimistic mood, but ultimately I don't know that it changes our willingness to cooperate and to do the work that we're doing. And so just from kind of a more kind of attitude approach, I think it's just we just have to do the work, and it doesn't matter whether or not we'll make it. I think every action that we take today, even if it avoids 0.0001 degree of warming, that's suffering avoided for both humans and for living creatures. So even if we pass 1.5 or we pass 2 degrees, if we don't make it to 4 degrees, that's suffering avoided, and that's worth fighting for, I think.
So I think we can maybe collect a few questions from here. So if you would just raise your hand. Yeah, so we have 3 questions, one there, and then one there.
Just a quick question in terms of maybe a more positive view, where when you were talking about the satellites and where most of them are produced by a very small number of people, I wonder if there's actually, ironically, an opportunity in that you still have access to the data and you're able to kind of make decisions from that. And therefore, is there a sort of leverage effect within this whole systems approach of we just need to line everything up and get those points tipping in the right way? And it'd be really interesting to just hear your thoughts on how you view the prioritization and structuring of those opportunities that we can take advantage of with some of those people progressing faster than others.
Firstly, thank you so much for a whole comprehensive discussion on that. My question, I think I'll just provide a bit of a context. So I worked on something where I looked at how the political party at the center of the state, for India specifically, aligns with some state parties, and how that affects the damages funds for floods. So I looked at floods, and I found that due to other motivations of the state, like saffronization, for most of the states, some states are unfairly being benefited from the damages funds, and they are getting more amount of assistance from the center. So in terms of that, I think there are some other aspects of justice that plays into, for a few very specific countries. So how do you think that plays out in the longer run when there are very nitty-gritties that are very specific to some countries. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for very fascinating talks, and I think all these questions are going to be quite separate. But yeah, my question was, I guess, linking the issue around justice, around carbon offsetting, and maybe even preventing climate change. Like, all these actions around carbon offsetting can be done in a way that sometimes disadvantages poorer people or disadvantaged people. And I know you guys spoke to that on a global level. But my question is at a local level, and maybe, I'm sorry you get this question a lot, but in terms of the low traffic neighborhoods in Oxford, I would just be interested on your view, I guess directly to the person who works in the city council, but others as well, on whether that method, like that initiative of low traffic neighborhoods, which is trying to reduce climate change, is having some kind of effect in terms of justice on people who need the transport for going places, and whether there's some kind of analysis or data that has been done on the effects of those at the local level.
Do you just want to self-select it too? Who takes which one? Yeah, maybe the last one.
I start with the first question before I forget it. Yes, I agree with you. So I'm quite aware that whatever goes on the map has always been political, whether that's based on satellites or whether that's based on traditional cartography. That's always been hyper-political, not just what is on the map, but it's also what is not on the map. That has always been an issue, and that issue has never been random. There's a whole argument how the standard projections we use to project maps are also colonial, because they blow up certain areas visually at the expense of others, and the ones that look larger are the ones closer to the poles, which tend to be those inhabited by white people. So there's always been a highly political element on geospatial knowledge. The majority of satellites are owned by Elon via Starlink, and what Jeff Bezos and Amazon Web Services are also building in ICT infrastructure. Those are ICT satellites. So those are the ones that you need for communication, which in itself is also another political discussion that goes more to human rights, access to internet, which is often shut down. The imagery market is slightly separate, but the two biggest players are headquartered in the US, so they only fall under the US law, but they circulate everywhere. What we have is an absence of an international framework to regulate the market. There is a UN body, but it's much behind. Policy always tends to be behind tech, because tech moves extremely quickly. So most of my work actually tries to, so I do work a lot with people in the tech sector, the geospatial tech sector specifically, but also the algorithmic tech sector, to really use the advantages that are generated, the tech advantages that are generated in that sector, to feed into better analytics for policymaking, because policymakers generally have no idea what's possible with tech, and they're very comfortable in doing things the way they have always done it. But now we just have so much more instrument at our hands, and for me, there's a lot of truth-telling with data to countercheck claims by companies. I have very little understanding why we still rely on self-reporting, by the way, from companies. There's no reason, and there's so much incentive to lie. So for me, it makes no sense to do it if we now have so much better tools at our hands. But policy is slow to react, and tech is very fast. So we do have a lot of advances there, and I try to maximize everything I can from the tech sector for better policies. But there's only one of me, and there's a big amount of problems. And then we need people like Sam and like Alexis that know what to do with this evidence to feed it back into better policies. So it all has to be streamlined, like you say, it has to be interlinked, and we do some of it here, but it's a really, really big problem. It's a global problem, and a lot of it, the absence of transitions, is not just due to the lack of information, it's often also just lack of will and vetted interests. But you're right, there is a lot of advances that we use, and that's exactly at the core of my work, how to bring all the tech advances into better insight for policies.
I'll just quickly address the damages question. I don't know if Sam, you have some thoughts on loss and damage, but just it's an excellent question on the sort of distribution piece of how funds should be distributed once it's at the national level. But just to zoom out, the current state of the discussions on loss and damage are still very much on a country-to-country basis, who should pay in and who should get to receive funds. This was a big part of the technical negotiations that established the funds at COP27 in 2022. So
there was an ongoing dispute over which countries could qualify to receive funds from the Loss and Damage Fund. And for example, on the table at one point during the negotiations was a categorization according to your status in the World Bank, your income categorization, that would have excluded Pakistan, for example, which was used as a case study over and over again during the negotiations, having just had the floods, as the prime candidate for receiving funds from the Loss and Damage Fund. So there's between COP27 and COP28, there was a transitional committee who was established to basically hammer out those details of what should it be called, who should host it, who should pay in, and who should get to receive funds. They came to an agreement just before COP28, and some funds were paid in at COP28, but there's still a very long road to decide, even at the country level, who will get it. And then the next big challenge is, once you get to the country level, how does that get distributed nationally? But we're still a ways off from that.
So that's why I'm keen to hear about the local thing.
Okay, so I'm gonna try and address three things. So firstly, the sort of right back to the earlier point. I mean, we can take a bit of optimism from the fact that actually we have actually tackled two massive problems at a reasonable velocity. One of them was acid rain. We all had to, all countries had to act on that. And the other one was CFCs and their removal to fix the ozone layer. So I mean, removal of carbon is way more difficult, obviously, but there is at least some precedent we can cling on to. And distribution of funds at local level. I mean, this is definitely not just a few countries. Like, it's called pork barreling. It happens everywhere. I'm pretty certain there's like a standing private eye column about it happening in the UK. So. Yes, unfortunately so. So low traffic neighbourhoods, so I'm just going to say, done by a different council, done by the county council, not us, but I will talk about it anyway. I mean, personally, I have never really considered low traffic neighbourhoods as a climate intervention. They're actually a road safety intervention, really. I mean, they pretty much cut road collisions by a half. Pretty much when you look at like longitudinal studies of this, amount of road traffic collisions, like amazingly, is proportional to the amount of traffic. It turns out. So I mean, I think the objectives with them have got slightly confused. I mean, and the sort of the justice point. I mean, so I'm in my mid-30s. The number of cars on the road in the UK in my lifetime has doubled from 20 million to 40 million, and I don't remember being consulted about that either. The status quo is also broken, right? In Oxfordshire, traffic on our roads grows by 3% a year. So are we just going to say, okay, yeah, we'll just fill up all of the side residential roads forever and never do anything about it? I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a sort of, there is the redistribution of traffic onto arterial routes problem, but I think, I mean, my retort to that is we should be tackling that too, right? It's not just an either or. Yeah, I think, and there are the more strategic schemes coming down the pipe which are meant to address those. So I mean, Oxford is actually in a reasonably good place because it does have these smaller, much more localised interventions, but it does also have a vision for the bigger stuff as well, which is meant to tackle it on a much more strategic kind of network level. So yeah.
Yeah, just very quickly, let me say something in praise of place as a sort of a device of getting things done and getting things done probably more efficiently and more fairly. It is striking in the UK where we have a reasonably good climate change governance at the national level, and yet a lot of the action happens at the local level. Just before COVID, you may remember there was this wave of local councils declaring a climate emergency, and that created an unbelievable vibrancy that sort of filtered up. One example is there were sort of a series of sort of climate assemblies or climate juries where local people came together and sort of asked, what do you think we should do about climate change? And they were not experts, they're literally taken from the street. But if you engage those people in a conversation, you have to sort of provide some of the facts. But it's fascinating to see how willing people become to do something about climate change, and that then strengthens the sort of the spine of the politicians. Occasionally, people say the the 6 carbon budget, the one that sort of sets the party is starting. So the 6, I must speak faster. The 6 carbon budget is sort of our target for the 2030s. That was passed with very little debate at the time, much less certainly than we would have now. And one contributing factor was there has been a climate assembly before, where voters essentially put a set of demands to Parliament and says, on climate change, could you please do the following? And it worked. Don't say it didn't work.
So there's a note of caution in there. So I mean, we did have a climate jury in Oxford. It sort of informed the city council's sort of like target date for various things. So we have net zero council by 2030, net zero city by 2040, and that directly came out of the climate assembly. The one note of caution is there is still quite a big gap between people's concern about this and people's willingness to actually do something about it. So there's a very good, I think it was a German, there's a YouGov poll of some people from Germany, and scales of like people who are concerned about climate change, all the way over here, and then there's like, are you willing to put money on the table, change your lifestyle, blah blah blah, in order to do something about it, and those two graphs are not lined up, and I think certainly what we're now seeing, it's interesting. I have a friend, Oxford Friends of the Earth, he's been an activist for decades and decades, and he says the vibe has kind of changed now, because he used to campaign against big corporations, against governments, to kind of get this on the table, get climate change taken seriously. Everybody agrees that it's a problem now. That battle is kind of won. The battle is now on individual policies. It is arguing about LTNs. It's actually the implementation of this stuff. And the reason the vibe has changed is because it's not, activists versus governments, Shell, whatever. It's now neighbours arguing about these policies instead. It's actually got much more local and much more personal. So I think, there's sort of like dragons here, which is actually the policy to actually change and implement this stuff. I mean, you're seeing the sort of the pushback from various farmers across Europe now about the environmental changes coming to them, and this is it, right? So
I would have loved to finish on a more positive note, but that's the topic. And I guess at least people who are talking about it means that the policies are actually reaching something and changing stuff. So resistance, I guess, is sometimes inherent in change, but we'll be working with that. And thank you to the panelists for making time. Thank you to all of you for making time to spend this early evening and also early evening of Valentine's Day here. I think there were a few reminders sent from the back of the room and invitations to transition to that part of the evening. And we look forward to seeing you at future events here. And thank you so much for Jonathan and Kellogg College for hosting all of us tonight. Thank you.